The video game industry is the fastest growing industry in entertainment. In recent years, technological advancements have enabled the latest generations of games and consoles to provide extremely realistic and lifelike action. Many leading figureheads, however, blame video games on society's problems and push for vigorous censorship of the content. As an avid gamer, I myself question the effects of violence in video games on my own behavior. From my perspective, I myself do not find the claim to be true and believe that violent behavior is not a result of media. However, I have my own bias toward video games because of my own personal experience with them. This bias gives me a more positive outlook on the effects of violence in video games. So let's examine why people believe that video games affect people's behavior. Many say violent video games promote violent behavior. This leads many people to push for censorship in video games. How do the major people pushing for censorship of video games prove their claims? This leads to the effects model that most of this research is based on. Most research into the effects of violence in video games is based on the idea that all things we consume in the media affect us in some way, be it positive or negative. This is called the effects model of research. The idea is that the media is to blame, and from this, try to make links from the product back to the world of actual violence. However, David Gauntlet outlined in his essay, 10 Things Wrong with the Effects Model, points out the flaws of this type of research. The main issue about this method is that there is no distinction between types of violence. For example, in this method of research, arguments are classified the same as rape or murder. Therefore, when research talks about increased violent tendencies, it is difficult to distinguish what type of violence it implies. Because of this issue with language, it makes it easier for researchers to generalize all types of violence into a single category. Furthermore, the theory justifies itself with this research, and the research justifies itself on the assumption that the theory is true. This makes the research flawed because it does not prove anything. Many of these researches fail to take into account the importance of biological, developmental, and environmental factors that contribute to violence. These factors can shape minors' behaviors toward more violent behaviors. In addition, these correlation studies lead to conclusions without proof. Many of these claims seem a bit over-exaggerated, or are they? Many school shootings and other violent behaviors in minors have been blamed on video game violence.
Attorneys for the families of 3 fallen officers were back in court today over a lawsuit against the makers of the video games Grand Theft Auto 3 and Grand Theft Auto Vice City. The relatives of the murdered officers contend that the video games may have contributed to the deaths of their loved ones.
The defendants say the video game is protected under the First Amendment.
A judge has sentenced convicted cop killer Devin Moore to the stiffest penalty possible, saying post-traumatic stress disorder did not give Moore the right to take 3 lives.
In many cases, video game violence is blamed for violent actions in minors, such as murder. One example is 18-year-old Devin Moore's murder of 3 Alabama police officers. Devin Moore had played the video game Grand Theft Auto for a long period of time. Prior to the murder, this led to the lawsuit of the video game Grand Theft Auto as having an influence for Devin Moore's actions. This lawsuit, led by Jack Thompson, a strong anti-video game violence advocate, claims that Devin Moore was in effect trained to do what he did by the video game. However, this lawsuit never held in court because of a lack of evidence. This is mainly because Thompson jumped to the assumption that Moore's history with video games prompted him to murder. Thompson has been in several cases against violence in video games, with all of his cases never succeeding. The reason for this being that there has been a lack of evidence and valid research that supports Thompson's argument that violent video games promote violent behavior. For example, Thompson claimed that all schools shootings were by gamers. However, a federal study in 2007 found that only 17% of shootings in schools were by gamers.
The problem, and what Tony doesn't apparently know, is that Harvard and Indiana universities have determined that these games are actually processed in an adolescent. And what Tony doesn't apparently know is that Harvard and Indiana universities have determined that these games are actually processed in an adolescent and in a teen in the part of the brain in which copycatting is likely to occur, whereas adults process them in the forebrain where differentiation between reality and fantasy occur. In Oakland, California, Matt, Daryl Stallworth, the prosecutor, has asked me to help him prove to a jury in a murder trial that older men were using Grand Theft Auto 3 as a murder and carjacking simulator to train teens on how to do.
Somewhat brings to the case. Why has none of these cases succeeded, and why is there no actual valid evidence that leads to violent behavior? This all returns to David Galton's argument. Most research that has occurred have very small sample sizes, and many of them are subjective in that it relies on the test subjects to determine how violent video games impacted their lives. Because it relies on the perception of the test subjects, the research is in turn biased and not objective. In addition, many of these studies are just correlation studies, therefore lack sufficient evidence that proves the theory. Furthermore, many of these researches rely on language to define their terms and present the evidence. For example, many of the conclusions use very broad terms such as tended to and often when associated with violent behavior. These terms cannot be measured and cannot be compared objectively or accurately. There has also been studies that prove otherwise. On the other side of the argument, Williams, a professor at the University of Illinois, developed a long-term study of video games, and the results showed no concrete information that proved that video games cause violent behavior. In comparison, people that played video games showed no differing behavior than those that did. However, Williams acknowledged that the data could not prove nor disprove either side of the argument. Furthermore, a study in 2009 concluded that there is no substantial evidence of desensitization from playing violent video games or correlation in violence in video games with violence in real life. Does the industry do anything about the accusations that have been placed on violent video games? Even in the video game industry itself, the ESRB in America and PEGI in Europe regulate video game ratings. This indicates that the industry recognizes the fact that not all games are targeted toward minors. Some areas such as the UK even make it illegal to sell mature rated video games to minors. It is clear that the industry acknowledges that all games are not targeted toward minors, and it is the goal of the parents to regulate their children. It is only the groups and people that jump to the assumptions that video games are associated with violent behavior that lead to these false accusations with lack of evidence. Why, with so much evidence on either side, is it possible for one side to be true? There is evidence that gives itself to prove it either side of the argument, neither side having truly concrete evidence that there is a correlation between violence in video games and violent behavior. To look at this in a broader perspective, all forms of media have at some point in time been accused of causing violent behavior. Throughout the course of history, none of these accusations have been proven or disproven. This is because there is no justification for either side of the argument. The reason for this is that there are too many factors that contribute to violent behavior, and none of these factors can be singled out and tested independently. For this reason, the research that is available and has been done is very subjective. The subjectivity lends itself to bias and assumptions that do not have enough evidence to support it. Because of the lack of objectivity in many of these studies that occur, violence in video games cannot be proven nor disproven. In addition, throughout human history, violence has been prevalent, and the media chooses to represent this aspect of human nature. Video games should no longer be the scapegoat to violence in society because there are a range of factors that contribute to violent behavior. In conclusion, violence in video games alone cannot be the direct causation of violent behavior.